China appears to be constructing the ultimate tool of social control, a comprehensive credit score system that will make your head spin. That's what the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, wrote on October 5, 2015. This newly emerging, soon-to-be all-encompassing surveillance network, it said, would give everyone in China a score between 350 and 950. But unlike, say, American credit scores, these would punish everything from jaywalking to government criticism. Even more disturbingly, you could be responsible for the actions of your friends and family. The rest of the article mainly focused on the United States. The ACLU, after all, is an American nonprofit. It lobbies for things like free speech, privacy, and criminal justice reform. This was not new reporting. The author was open about his sources, other articles he had read online. Neither did he claim to have any expertise on China. In fact, just 3 days later, he updated the article, softening the tone and emphasizing that he only meant to caution against potential abuses in America. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that a high-profile, well-respected institution had stamped its seal of approval, and other organizations took notice. 2 days after the original ACLU article went live and a day before it issued the update, Computer World republished it, calling the Chinese system Orwellian. Popular Science wrote that although, quote, the system isn't explicitly dystopian yet, it has all the pieces to be dystopian at a moment's notice. And Reason claimed these scores would soon define Chinese citizens' lives. In less than a week, the social credit system had not only entered the English media landscape, but also, seemingly, amassed a body of evidence. Multiple sources endorsing the same alarming conclusion. Never mind that they all reference the same ACLU report written by a non-expert, largely about the United States, itself based on earlier speculation. News travels fast, and headlines even faster. There was no need for some grand conspiracy to smear China, or bad faith on the part of any individual author. The simple market pressures of 21st century journalism were enough to make a story appear out of thin air. America's often quite justified suspicion of the Chinese government and technology in general were just icing on the cake. Since then, the social credit system has truly taken on a life of its own, with coverage by the Financial Times, Economist, Fortune, and countless others. This now 8-year-old game of telephone culminated in an appearance at the White House, with Vice President Mike Pence describing it as an Orwellian system premised on controlling virtually every facet of human life. And yet, ask a friend, colleague, or classmate who spent time in China about their experience, and you'll likely be met with confusion. This is not a case of censorship. The Chinese government does engage in extensive censorship, but for the social credit system to work as described, the public must be, at a minimum, aware of its existence. Neither is this the result of propaganda. The government does engage in propaganda, but in this case the response is not anger, frustration, or disagreement, just confusion. Because, for all of its well-documented, genuine atrocities, the Orwellian credit score system imagined by many in the media simply doesn't exist. The truth, however, is far more revealing. Sponsored by Skillshare. Get a 1-month free trial and start learning everything from programming to graphic design. In June 2014, the State Council of China published this planning outline for the establishment of a social credit system. Now, the first thing you should know about this document is that it's incredibly boring and almost artfully vague. Full of dense phrases like promote the improvement of legal person governance, you almost have to admire how little it manages to say in 16,000 Chinese characters. The second thing to note is the broader context in which it was released. 1 month earlier, in May of 2014, the same government announced what it described as a war on terror against violent extremism in Xinjiang. This would later evolve into a full-blown attack on Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities, including mass incarceration, surveillance, and violence that continues in modified form to this day. In other words, this was a time when much of the world was becoming, understandably, increasingly skeptical of the Chinese government. And here was this new, suspiciously ambiguous notion of social credit. The motive for some kind of inescapable system of surveillance and control seemed undeniable. In fact, what made the myth so potent was that it did contain an element of truth. In the years since, China has constructed a similarly oppressive, albeit less high-tech, police state in Xinjiang, involving DNA collection, phone searches, and security checkpoints. Besides, what else could the term social credit refer to? And if it truly had nothing to hide, why was the plan written in such cryptic language? But what few casual observers understood is that cryptic, inscrutable, Leninist-steeped jargon is kind of the Chinese Communist Party's whole thing. And there's a very specific reason. The benefits of autocracy for an autocrat are so obvious, complete unchecked authority, that it's easy to forget the trade-off. With complete authority comes complete responsibility. There's no one to blame. Consider how often Democrats and Republicans use each other as scapegoats. Dictators don't have that luxury. So, to insulate themselves from criticism, they often delegate a lot more power than you might expect. Now, make no mistake, Beijing always gets the final word, but think of it as an architect. It produces the national blueprint, first in the form of a policy document and later a policy outline, but whose actual implementation it outsources to lower levels of government, its engineers. When the actual building looks nothing like the concept art, the central government can keep its hands clean by pointing to its beautifully vague, boringly unobjectionable sketches. At the same time, it also, of course, has things it wants to accomplish, things that need to be communicated to the engineers. Thus, while these policy documents, as we saw, are indeed horribly tedious, they're not entirely devoid of content. You just have to understand party speak. So, what did it mean by social credit? According to Jeremy Dahm, senior fellow at Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center and someone fluent in party speak, it was never a single policy. It wasn't even a very well-outlined goal. Instead, it was always, quote, shorthand for a broad range of efforts. The first of which was financial. In short, the millions born before the one-child policy became law in 1980 were in their prime working age years during the Chinese boom of the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. That large mass of workers kept labor costs down, attracting foreign companies, who in turn invested that profit back into the country. But as all those workers began to retire, Chinese labor became a lot more expensive, leading to lower profits, and therefore less investment. That investment, however, could be replaced with consumption. In summary, if China was to keep growing, it needed to start spending. Yet, at the time, just 1/5 of the population had a credit report. Without banks or credit cards, they couldn't take out loans. And without loans, they couldn't spend as much money. Meanwhile, much of this large unbanked population used Chinese apps like WeChat and Alipay on a daily basis. So the thinking was, what if all that data could be used to create alternative credit scores? 8 private companies were selected to do just that as part of a pilot project. The most famous was Sesame Credit, an optional service that gave users a 3-digit score. The second and larger focus of social credit was centered around trust. Ironically, while outsiders view China as a tightly controlled, closely monitored police state, many in China saw their country as the Wild West, untamed, unregulated, and lacking in consequences. In 2008, for instance, a company was caught using toxic chemicals in its milk and baby formula, making thousands of children sick. Scandals like these left deep nationwide scars. some parents are, understandably, still suspicious of Chinese milk today. At the same time, corruption, once tolerated as a necessary ingredient to rapid economic growth, was beginning to reach a boiling point. Not only was the party losing control of its own members, but the public was starting to take notice. Stories of county bureaucrats driving Lamborghinis despite their measly official salaries were attracting a bit too much attention. And in the eyes of the party, all these things were connected. The milk, the corruption, it all represented a crisis of moral failure. One consequence of which was a general lack of trust throughout Chinese society. The solution was to build what it called, in its typically ambiguous way, a reputation society. Remember, this was the architect telling the engineer, here's a vaguely defined problem, now go try and solve it. The results were as random and chaotic as you'd expect. What, as a local bureaucrat, are you supposed to do with these instructions? No one knows, and that's the point. A few dozen cities across China rushed to implement their own social credit reputation systems, each with their own set of rules and rewards. One city announced it would subtract 3 points for every 5 cigarettes smoked, and add 5 for every 15,000 steps walked. No explanation was offered for how these numbers were determined, much less how this could possibly be enforced. But it didn't matter. The public backlash was so strong that the proposal was abandoned. Bizarrely, another city said it would penalize drunk driving and reward volunteer work, but then decided to make the system optional. A third city gave every citizen a grade from A to D, until someone compared it to the Japanese occupation of China, and it quietly disappeared. It was all very weird and impractical. Needless to say, the central government was thoroughly unimpressed. Evidently, the construction didn't match the blueprint. Alternatively, perhaps Beijing miscalculated the public's reaction and saw its opportunity to swoop in and protect the country from those terrible, no-good engineers. The People's Bank of China refused to renew the licenses of all 8 companies participating in the financial pilot project. Beijing also called out several local governments for being overzealous, instructing them to only punish what was already illegal. The third and final component of social credit are blacklists. Previously, each government ministry maintained separate records, meaning someone could violate the rules of, say, the tax authorities without the food inspector knowing. Now they're supposed to share that data, not only internally but also with the public. So, for example, you could search the name of a company and decide if it's reputable. Generally trustworthy entities are placed on so-called red lists, and repeat offenders on blacklists. Most of these are companies, though their owners and managers can be implicated too. As a ballpark, somewhere between 1 and 2% of companies and 0.15 to 0.3% of people are blacklisted each year. In the most extreme case, offenders are banned from taking flights or trains or sending their children to private schools. But these restrictions only apply to one type of offense: those who refuse to pay damages found by a judge, despite having the requisite funds. Once they've fulfilled their court orders, they're removed from the blacklist. By 2018, over 12 million of these judgment defaulters had been affected. Some cities even broadcast their names in movie theaters. Okay, let's review. One part of social credit was financial, one about cities incentivizing good behavior, and the third an attempt to share government data. The first involved 8 companies, the second dozens of different cities, and the third several independent ministries. One was private, the other 2 public. Some were optional, others not. Together, they have very little in common besides the label social credit. If you're not at least slightly confused by now, you should probably be concerned. Remember, this was not designed for global comprehension. Actually, it wasn't really designed for local comprehension. It was designed to leave the door open for experimentation and to retain some plausible deniability for the central government. So it should be no surprise that virtually every detail was lost on the media. Instead of 3 separate projects, many journalists lumped them all together as one. The inputs of privately owned Sesame Credit, your shopping behavior for instance, were paired with the state-sponsored punishments of the entirely separate blacklists, travel restrictions for example. Thus, the story became, if you buy the wrong things, the CCP will ban you from travel. Social credit was an easy device through which to conceive of and critique Chinese authoritarianism. The irony being that the reason this 1984-style surveillance was so believable in the first place is also the reason the party doesn't need it. Chinese surveillance isn't some new development. The battle for anonymity was lost well before the birth of social credit. All accounts on all Chinese websites require real name registration, so does every SIM card and internet cafe. If and when laws, including social credit, are weaponized, it's because of the underlying system, the nearly unchecked discretion afforded to individual police officers and bureaucrats. Now, it would be clean and simple to end the video here by concluding that journalists are just lazy and ran with a false narrative. But that too would be lazy. This is not just a case of journalists seeing what they wanted to see, because China also feeds into these pre-existing anxieties. To see how, humor me with one final tangent. In democracies, politics seem to get in the way of simple solutions to healthcare, education, and infrastructure. When Congress can't seem to get anything done, it's easy to start thinking of party politics as a bug, not a feature. If only I were General Secretary for a day, everything would be so much better. If democracy is messy, inefficient, and complicated, autocracy must be clean, efficient, and simple. But not necessarily. If you're a student, think about the last time you tried to herd the sheep that were the members of your group project. If you work in an office, recall how difficult it is to get sales and finance to collaborate. Now multiply that complexity by 100 million people, the size of the Communist Party. Though they may march under the same banner, people are people. 100 million members means 100 million feuds, allegiances, and career ambitions. By delegating power in order to share responsibility, China opens the door to a certain version of messy politics. Both the local governments and private companies responsible for implementing Beijing's vision of social credit had their own incentives, one of which was to overstate their capabilities. If you think Silicon Valley is the capital of empty buzzwords, try talking to executives at Alibaba or party officials from up-and-coming cities like Suzhou. Desperate to impress their bosses in Beijing, they throw around terms like big data, blockchain, and smart cities like it's no one's business. Take Sesame Credit, for instance. To curry favor with the authorities, the company painted a beautiful picture full of super advanced algorithms. To entice users, it advertised powerful benefits like travel visas to Europe. The English-language media, already believing Sesame Credit to be the official manifestation of social credit, effectively bought into this marketing, which it then resold to a global audience by emphasizing how this super advanced technology could be weaponized. In reality, Sesame Credit was a, frankly amateur, version of the Target Red Card. It calculated how often, not what you purchased, whether you'd completed your profile, not what it said, and how many accounts you'd added on the app as friends, not who they were. In exchange for sharing this basic data with the company, you could do things like rent a bike without leaving a deposit. A high score couldn't grant you a visa to Europe, only Europe can do that. All it could do is help prove your finances, replacing one of several documents required to apply. Likewise, local governments love nebulous terms like social credit because, unlike, say, GDP growth, it's very hard to measure. This lack of oversight makes it all too easy to exaggerate claims about algorithms, which often meant simple addition and subtraction, and big data, which was often recorded on spreadsheets, or in one city, I kid you not, clipboards. This, for instance, is the average number of data points per citizen in each of these 5 pilot cities. The social credit dystopia imagined by many, on the other hand, would require close coordination between hundreds of different ministries, all of which are competing for promotions, budget allocations, and regulatory authority. This is not at all to say China is incapable of doing big and scary things. The point is that we should approach its claims about big data and machine learning with the same degree of skepticism as we would any Silicon Valley startup. Currently, one side is primed to see China as 10 feet tall, and the other is incentivized to exaggerate its height. What could go wrong? Conversely, what you can't go wrong with are these classes on productivity and learning new things with spaced repetition that can help you advance or kickstart a new career. We all have dreams, goals, and creative projects in mind, but if you're like me, you need a little push to get things going. Maybe you've always wanted to learn graphic design, but don't know where to start. This class walks you through everything you need to know about Photoshop, right from the very basics. Skillshare is an online learning community with not only thousands of courses on everything from graphic design to programming, but also a superior learning environment. By sharing your work with others, getting feedback, and asking questions, you can engage with each lesson and feel rewarded. Because you get access to every lesson with a single subscription, you're motivated to make the most of your membership. The first 1,000 people to join by clicking the link on screen now get a 1-month free trial. That's 1 full month you can take unlimited classes with no restrictions. Thanks again to Skillshare for sponsoring this video.